Chapter 12 of That Mainwaring Affair. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That Mainwaring Affair by A. Maynard Barber. Chapter 12. X-Rays. On the morning following Scott's interview with Hobson, he awoke at an early hour, vaguely conscious of some disturbing influence, though unable to tell what had awakened him. He lay for a moment, recalling the events of the preceding day, then suddenly remembered that this was the day fixed for the funeral of Hugh Mainwaring. None of the servants were astir about the house, but Scott soon became conscious of the sound of stealthy movements and subdued voices coming through the open window, and rising, he looked out. At first he could see nothing unusual. It was just sunrise, and the river at a little distance shimmering in the golden light held him entranced by its beauty. Then a slight rustling in the shrubbery near the lake attracted his attention. The golden shafts of sunlight had not yet reached that small body of water, and it lay smooth and unbroken as the surface of a mirror, so clear at that hour that one could easily look into its depths. Suddenly a light boat shot out from the side nearest the grove, breaking the smooth surface into 1,000 rippling waves of light. In the boat were two men, one of whom Scott instantly recognized as the detective. The other, who was rowing and had his back towards the house, seemed to be a stranger. Someone concealed in the shrubbery called to the boatmen, whereupon they rowed across in that direction, stopping a few yards from shore. Here they rested a few moments till the surface was again smooth, when, both men having carefully peered into the depths of the little lake, the detective proceeded to let down a drag into the water. "By George!" Scott ejaculated. "The sly old fox is improving the opportunity, while every one is asleep, to drag the lake in search of whatever the coachman threw in there. All right, my dear sir, go ahead. But I'm somewhat interested in this affair myself, and I don't intend that you shall monopolize all the facts in the case." Keeping an eye on the boat, he dressed quickly, and letting himself out at the front entrance, he hastened down the walk through the grove to the edge of the lake, keeping himself concealed among the trees. The boat was moving slowly back and forth, and was now in such a position that Scott could see the face of the man rowing, who proved to be, as he had thought, a stranger. On the other side, seated under the flowering shrubs and trees bordering the lake, was Joe, the stable boy, watching proceedings with intense interest. With a smile, the young secretary followed his example, seating himself at the foot of an ancient elm whose branches drooped nearly to the ground. "All right, Mr. Detective," he said, "I can stay as long as you. If you fail to make a success of your work this morning, no one will be the wiser, but in case you find anything, I propose to know something about it myself." The sun was now shining brightly, but the hour was yet so early that there was little danger of anyone else appearing on the scene, especially as it was Sunday morning. For nearly an hour Mr. Merrick and his companion rowed slowly back and forth in constantly widening circles, meeting no success and saying little. Suddenly, while Scott was facing the face of the stranger, wondering who he might be, he heard a low exclamation, and saw that the drag had fastened itself upon some object at the bottom of the lake. He watched eagerly as they drew it to the surface, and could scarcely restrain a cry of astonishment as he saw what it was. But before either of the men could secure it, it had slipped and fallen again into the water. With language more forcible than elegant, the drag was again lowered, and the boat once more began its slow trailing. This time they had not so long to wait for success. The drag was brought to the surface, but carrying in its clutches an entirely different object, and one which the young secretary was totally unfamiliar, a somewhat rusty revolver. Mr. Merrick's back was now towards Scott, but the latter saw him take something from his pocket, which he seemed to compare with the revolver, at the same time remarking to the stranger, who was watching with an appearance of great interest, "A pretty good find, Jim, pretty good. However, we'll have another try for that box, whatever it is. It may amount to something, or it may not, but it will do no harm to make a trial." Having let down the drag once more, he glanced at the house, then at his watch, saying, "No signs of anyone astir. We're all right for another hour yet." After a few more turns, Scott saw them suddenly pulling in the ropes, and once more the box appeared, rusty and covered with slime, but still familiar. He at once sprang to his feet, and sauntered carelessly down the walk, humming a tune and watching the occupants of the boat with an air of mild curiosity. The stranger was the first to see him, and with an expression of evident disgust gave Merrick warning of his approach. If the detective felt any annoyance, he did not betray it as he turned and nodded to Scott in the most nonchalant manner possible, as though dragging the lake were an everyday occurrence. "You've been fishing, I see," said Scott pleasantly. "How did you make out?" "Well, I've made this find which you see here," answered Mr. Merrick, as the boat headed for shore. "I don't know yet what it is, but it has not lain long in the water, and it may be worth looking into." Scott made no reply until the detective had sprung ashore. Then, as the latter proceeded to examine the box, leaving his companion to take care of the boat and drag, he said in a low tone, "That is likely to prove an important discovery, Mr. Merrick." "You are familiar with it, then?" queried the latter. "I have seen it in Mr. Mainwaring's safe. That was the box in which he kept the old jewels that were stolen on the night of the murder." Mr. Merrick whistled softly and studied the box anew. "Well, there are no jewels in it now, but we will open it. There is no one up yet to let us into the house, so suppose we go to the stables. We'll be safe there from intrusion." They proceeded to the stables, and arriving there, Scott was puzzled to see Merrick's companion at work and evidently perfectly at home. "We're going to use your room a while, Matthews," said Merrick carelessly. Then, noting the surprise on Scott's face, he added, "This is Matthews, the new coachman, Mr. Scott. I thought you knew of his coming." "At your service, sir," said Matthews respectfully, lifting his cap in response to Scott's greeting, while the latter inquired, as he and the detective passed upstairs together, "When did he come?" "Yesterday afternoon. He applied for the position, and as he happened to be an acquaintance of mine, Mr. Mainwaring hired him upon my recommendation. Now," as he locked the door of the room they had entered, "we will open this box as quickly as possible. I suppose there is no key to be found, and if there were, the lock is too rusty to work." With the aid of a file and chisel, the box was soon opened. The satin linings were somewhat water-soaked and discolored, and the box appeared to be empty, but on opening an inner compartment, there were exposed to view a pair of oddly shaped keys and a blood-stained handkerchief, the latter firmly knotted as though it had been used to bandage a wound of some kind. "Ah," said the detective with peculiar emphasis, examining the handkerchief, which was of fine linen, with the initials H.M. embroidered in one corner. "Did Mr. Mainwaring carry a handkerchief of that style?" "Yes, he carried that or one precisely like it the last day of his life." "Very good," was the only reply, as the detective carefully folded and pocketed the article with an air that indicated that he wished to say no more about it. "And these keys, do you recognize them?" "They were Mr. Mainwaring's private keys to his library and the southern hall." "The ones the valet said were missing?" "The same." Mr. Merrick, after studying them curiously for a moment, consigned them to his pocket also, and then began a careful inspection of the interior of the box. Scott watched him in silence, thinking meanwhile of the old document which he had found hidden away in its depths, and inwardly rejoicing that it had not been left to be discovered by the detective. Nothing in Mr. Merrick's manner or expression betrayed the nature of his thoughts, and so long as he chose to remain silent, Scott refrained from questioning him. At length he closed the box, saying indifferently, "Well, I don't know as there is any reason why I should detain you any longer, Mr. Scott. We have satisfied ourselves as to the contents of the box, and you have identified the articles. For the present, however, I would prefer that you say nothing of this." "Certainly, Mr. Merrick. The discovery, whatever its import, is your secret, and I shall make no mention of it whatever." "I don't know that it is of any special importance," said the detective carelessly, as they prepared to descend the stairs, "but it only confirms the opinion that I have had all along." "Don't you think that this tends to show that the murder and robbery were connected, notwithstanding Mr. Whitney's theories to the contrary?" Scott inquired, as they were about to separate. "Possibly," replied the other gravely, then added with a smile, "Mr. Whitney has his own preconceived ideas of the case, and tries to adapt the circumstances to suit them, when, in reality, one must first ascertain whatever facts are available, and adjust his theories accordingly." They parted company at the door of the stables, but Scott had not reached the house when the detective, with a peculiar smile, returned to the room upstairs, and once more opening the box, drew forth from underneath the satin linings a folded paper, yellow with age and covered with closely written lines, which he read with great interest, after which he remained absorbed in thought until aroused by the entrance of his friend, the coachman. Several hours later, Scott stood alone beside the casket of the murdered man. The head had been turned slightly to one side, and a spray of white blossoms, dropped with seeming carelessness within the casket, concealed all traces of the ghastly wound, their snowy petals scarcely whiter than the marble features of the dead. It lacked more than an hour of the time set for the funeral. None of the few invited guests would arrive for some time yet. The gentlemen of the house were